Chapter 18. I lied about not being able to wake up at will. I can do it. I lied about the two lovers talking fond nonsense as they walked along a beach. They were lovers, but they never walked along a beach. All they had was a couple of nights, and all they left behind them was unhappiness. I lied about most things by omission. Most of all, I've lied about myself. I'd hoped I'd be able to keep this together, but life doesn't always work out the way you want it to. Have you noticed that? It really doesn't. The apartment felt warm, unbelievably tropical and welcoming. After opening my eyes to check where I was, I shut them again for a blessed moment. Auckland's weight was enough to reassure me that I'd brought him along. I lay there for a while, listening to the soft drip of melting ice. Eventually, I struggled upright, spilling Auckland onto the sofa. He sprawled at an awkward angle, looking so dead that for a moment I thought that the battle was already lost. His face, though no longer green, was horribly stretched and degraded, and the right side was bright red. His hands were covered in liver spots that had not been there before, and the gash on his other cheek had been replaced by an open sore. I leaned close to him until I felt a wisp of pale breath, and then relaxed. A little bit. For a short while. The clock told me I'd been in Dreamland less than 3 hours, and that it was just after 7 o'clock. ACIA had obviously been here this time. The walls were all black, which meant the power to them had been shut off and the apartment wasn't screened anymore. Maybe they'd told the neighborhood I was dead. Books were spread all over the floor, and the bookcase lay broken in a corner. It looked much like the debris after a grav-bender fuck-up, and so it didn't really bother me much. I felt like an intruder myself. When I stood up, I felt the unreality of the apartment shouting at me from every corner. "What is all this?" it said. "Do you know where you are? Is this where you live?" It was kind of the feeling that you get when you come back home after a time away and see that the objects and space that you surround yourself with in a new light, stripped of their arbitrary familiarity. But it was much, much more than that. For a second, the whole thing threatened to shade away, at last to rebel and leave me to face myself and where I was. Then it settled, but grudgingly. And as I walked to the desk, I felt I did so on sufferance. The world will only take so much screwing about, and I've been walking a fine line for too long. The door had been nailed shut from the outside. Due to my somewhat unusual method of re-entry, that actually made me reasonably secure for a while. Unless... I opened the drawer and got out the bug Annalie. "Hi, Stark. Wow, you look like shit." "Shh." "What? Oh." The machine fell silent for a moment, and then a message flashed up on its panel of lights. "No bug," it said. And then, "Oh, hang on." After a pause, it flashed up. "Let's have a bit of a shufty at the vidiphone." I carried the machine to the vidiphone and waved it over it. "You don't have to do that," the message panel said. "Just hold me still." "Yep, the vidiphone's bugged," it said eventually. "Standard wave tapping, audio and video, voice activated. You want me to kill it? It's not a problem unless you want to make a call." Will they know it's been tampered with?" I said. "Yeah, it has self-checking. Bit of a downer." "Can you, scramble it temporarily?" "Hang on. Yeah, I can white noise code it. Longer than 20 seconds will cause an alert signal, though." 20 seconds is all I need. I punched a code in and waited. After a moment, the screen flicked on and Shelby appeared. "Stark, hi, wow." "Yeah, I know. Deep shit, Shelby. Way, way deep." "Lift?" "Could you?" "Your wish, Stark, is like, totally." "Where?" "My apartment roof. I've got to go." 20 minutes. The screen went blank. "Time to spare," the bug Annalie said approvingly. I think it must have done a personality transplant on itself. It wasn't irritating me half as much as usual. "You're sure there's nothing else?" Zip. I left the machine on the desk and went back to Auckland. Now that most of the ice on his clothes and hair had melted, he was sitting in a small pool of water. A little colour had come back to his face, but he still looked very, very ill. The sore looked angry, and I noticed that another one was on its way beneath his eye. He was, it had to be said, in terrible shape. But he was still alive, which meant he hadn't met Rafe. It was possible that Rafe had let him be to draw me on, but such restraint seemed unlikely. He could have dismantled his head, and the faint strands of Auckland's dreams would have still been enough to attract my attention. So, what was going on? What was Rafe playing at? I rubbed Auckland's hands for a while, trying to will warmth into them, and I was rewarded with a small moan. He was not going to surface for a while, but he wasn't going to die. Not yet, anyway. I covered him with a blanket and then rummaged around the apartment for a while, changing out of my own wet clothes into identical dry ones, locating some more cigarettes and that sort of thing. It didn't take very long, and I started to feel that type of tense nervousness you get when you're in a hurry, and suddenly you have a block of time that you've got no use for. For something to do, I headed towards the kitchen to nuke some water for a couple of cups of coffee, but I never got there. I was halfway across the living room when I heard the distinctive sound of air cars decelerating rapidly. A dread impulse took me to the window. I lifted the shade and looked down at the dark street below. 3 ACIA cars had pulled to an untidy halt down by the side of the building, and a pair of men emerged from each one. They glanced around with the time-honoured smugness of those who are above the law and carrying guns, and then they headed for the entrance to my building. "Bug, you shit!" I hissed, turning towards it. "You said the place was clean!" The machine said nothing. I picked it up and shook it uselessly. "Give yourself up, Stark," it said tersely. "Game's over. It's a wrap. Finito." I realized now why the machine had sounded different. The only bug in the apartment was the one I was holding. They'd found the bug Annalie and reprogrammed it. The bastard machine had changed sides. Furiously, not caring that I had far more important things to worry about, I strode back to the window and prepared to send the machine sailing out into the night. But then I had another thought, and slammed it back on the table before running over to the sofa. I called Auckland's name several times, but received only another low, unconscious moan in response. Swearing heavily, I grabbed the desk and pulled it into the corner of the room. The bug Annalie slid off and landed hard on the floor, but I found that I didn't mind that very much. When the desk was in position, I slipped my arms under Auckland's and hoiked him up. I steered him over towards the desk and let him fall gently onto it, back first. Then I picked his legs up and slid them forwards so that he was lying on the desk. I picked the bug Annalie up and ran to the bedroom where I grabbed a mini crunt from the bedside table. Then, carrying them both, I took a position up behind the door. I levered the bug Annalie's back panel off and slipped the mini crunt inside, first setting it for maximum sensitivity, and then I balanced the machine on the doorknob. "Hang on, Stark," the machine said. "What's that? What have you put inside me?" "Mini Crunt," I said. "Have a fucking nice day." Ignoring the machine's wails, I ran back to the desk and jumped on. I located my foot and set it for cutting, meanwhile cocking an ear towards the corridor. There was no sound yet, and I hadn't heard the elevator doors ping. I hoped it would take them at least half a minute to get through their own handiwork on the other side of the door. It wasn't much time, but it was all I had. Shielding my face with my hand, I held up the foot to the ceiling and flicked the switch. A green needle of light poked straight into the plexiplaster, which was a relief. Having never tried to cut holes in my roof before, I hadn't been sure it could be done. I knew I'd got through when I heard a startled yelp from the apartment above. As quickly as I could, hoping that the occupants above would have the sense to keep out of the way, I described a circle about 2 feet in diameter in the plexiplaster. I left the last couple of inches in place and shoved upwards hard. The disc of the floor popped up and into the apartment above. 2 faces of different sexes, but similarly advanced years, immediately took its place. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" the old man asked petulantly. He wore glasses and had a deeply lined face, sparsely capped with yellowy white hair. He looked like a dictionary illustration of the word old. "Cutting a hole in your floor," I said. These opportunities happen so seldom, you have to take advantage of them when they come. I do anyway. "Don't get smart with me, young man. You just stop that cutting right now." "I already have," I quipped with manic joy. His feed lines were too good to be true. I could have stood and chatted with the old twank all day. And now I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave my apartment via your apartment." "Oh, you'll do no such thing?" "Oh, yes, I will. And what's more, I'm going to need your help." I ducked down, slipped my hands under Auckland, and manhandled him into a standing position. A slumping position, to be more accurate. Unconscious bodies are sodding heavy. I lifted Auckland's hands so that they stuck up through the hole in the floor. The old man pushed them back again, and I stuck them through again. The old man again pushed them back through. "Oh, Neville," said the old woman crossly, "don't be such an old turd. Grab the gentleman's arms." "Nora," hissed the old guy, scandalized by this subversion from within. The woman ignored him, reached one of her hands into the hole and grabbed Auckland's arm. "You'll have to excuse my husband," she said. "He's very old." Neville dithered for a moment, and then, making it absolutely clear that it was against his better judgment, grabbed hold of Auckland's other hand. "It'll all end in tears," he said sourly. I didn't tell him that I thought he was almost certainly right. Bending my back, I grabbed Auckland round the waist and shoved him upwards as hard as I could. The hauling power of the couple above was not Herculean, but another shove sent Auckland clear just as I heard the sound of footsteps thundering down my corridor. I leapt off the desk, swung it as close to the corner of the room as I could, and then leapt up to grab the sides of the hole. I pulled myself up through it to the sound of shouted warnings from the outside of my apartment. As soon as I was in the old couple's living room, I placed the disc of ceiling material back into the hole. The jagged spur from the part that I had broken was just enough to stop it from dropping straight through. All right, that was just plain lucky. I admit it. I flipped Auckland onto my shoulder, almost fell over, and then got my balance. Thanking the old woman and agreeing to reimburse Neville for any costs involved in the fixing of their floor, I pulled open the front door as a loud crump from below told me that the bug alley had finally got what was coming to it. Some rather distressing screams suggested that a couple of the ACIA agents had been standing a bit too close. Still, never mind, eh? For one, you think Auckland and I would have left my apartment under our own steam if they'd caught us? For two, I don't give a fuck. I'm where I am now because when I was young, I wanted more. I wanted to live in a film. I looked, and I found. Now, I live in that film, and here the bad guys are everyone who isn't you, and if they die, you don't have to give a damn. Now, I don't care much for that younger me, and I wish to God I could take back what he did and unfind what he found. But I can't. I did what I did, and I was who I was. That was me once, just like the teenager who'd wanted to be a rock star was me, like the child who'd never had someone's brains splashed over his face, and whose fingers were small and warm and safe in his father's hand. They were all me, and they're all in there somewhere, standing alone and lost in twilight, but I can't find them. I can't find them because they hide when I try and look for them. They hide from me. They don't want to know me because they know nobody's really there. Oh, fuck. Ignore everything I say from now on. I'm not myself. Or maybe I am. It's been so long I can't remember. The more you get to know someone, the more there is to dislike. If you get to know them well enough, you hate them. And who knows me better than anyone else? Rafe does. I didn't hold out much hope for the ACIA men being confused by the old hole-in-the-ceiling ruse for long. And as I trudged up 3 flights of steps as quickly as I could, I hoped to hell that Shelby was going to be early for the second time in her life. May Shelby marry the least boring and stupid doctor, lawyer, or orthodontist of her generation. May their dinner parties be the most celebrated and exclusive soirees Branfield has ever known, and may they have a golf club specially formed for them to be the sole members of. She was there, is what I'm saying. As I took the last flight of steps 2 at a time, feeling my back pull and twist with the weight of an unconscious administrator, I heard the stair door bang down on my floor. They'd seen the circle in the ceiling. Or Neville had grasped on me, which was probably more likely. I kind of hoped he had, in fact. That way, he and his wife would have been less likely to have harm done to them. When I crashed out of the access door on the roof and saw Shelby perched on her heliporter, looking poised and cool in the glow of light from her instrument panel, I felt relief wash over me like a kiss of flowers. I stumbled over to within 10 feet and then slipped Alkland off my shoulders as gently as I could. It wasn't terribly gentle, and he made a quiet groaning noise, the first sound since we'd left the apartment. I dragged him over to the heliporter and kissed Shelby resoundingly on the cheek. She blushed and looked at me sideways. Well, hi, she said. Shelby, I said, I'm always happy to see you. It's always a pleasure. Always. Today, however, and I'm referring to the moment solely to the times when I've seen you in, shall we say, a professional capacity, I'm more pleased than ever before. Stark. There are no words to express my joy. None at all. I have a dictionary, and I've looked. I'd have to paint you a picture, sculpt a sculpture, or maybe try to express it through free-form improvisational dance. Stark, you're babbling, she said. It's completely charming babbling, and I don't want you to stop necessarily, but perhaps you can babble in the air? You're absolutely right, I said, and in my head I went through 50 different ways of getting myself and an unconscious actioneer onto one seat. I found one that wasn't blatant suicide and went for it. It involved hanging onto the centre pole with one hand, one leg next to Shelby's and the other helping brace Alkland on my side. I was tired before I was even fully in position, but it was the only way. The second I was settled, the access door opened and 3 ACIA men burst out at once. One had blood on his suit. Another man came out immediately after them. They all shouted at me simultaneously, and 2 of them dropped to their knees to take aim. The other seemed to try to stop them for some reason, but he was pissing in the wind. "Ew," said Shelby, wrinkling her perfect little nose. "They look way aggressive. I think we should go." She slammed the lever gracefully, and once more we were treated to the gratifying sight of bullets passing immediately underneath us as we rocketed up into the air. If anyone needs an extremely competent getaway driver who is also on first-name terms with the most prestigious maitre d's in Branfield and the surrounding districts, I can recommend Shelby without hesitation. Auckland slumped dangerously under the acceleration, and once more I had to do my reaching out and grabbing him thing. As Shelby took the heliporter up to 50 feet above the roof, I wrapped my left leg around Auckland's and clamped my arm around his chest. The heliporter swung into forward motion, and we streamed forward through a hail of bullets. Hail that was unusually travelling upwards and very quickly. With small and precise movements of her manicured hands, Shelby salaamed us through the air, obviously not actually dodging shells, but just making us harder to sight upon. Auckland grunted suddenly, and I concentrated on clinging onto him, my head hunched against the sound of rushing wind and passing bullets. The heliporter picked up speed, and within a few long seconds we were out of range, pelting forwards through the cold air. I looked back to see that they were still firing at us, tiny flashes of light in the darkness. "Where to?" asked Shelby intently. "Head for sound," I said, panting. "And keep high. How much charge do you have?" "Ah, bags," she said, grinning. "Something made me think I might be hearing from you again way soon. The batteries are full to the max." "Shelby," I looked at her, wanting to thank her, wanting to say how nice it was to have someone who was always there, who was my friend, who liked me. Not many people do, you know. Not enough, anyway. I couldn't get my mouth to work, and the sight of the kindness on her face was more than I could take. After a quick glance forward, Shelby reached out one arm and pulled it around my shoulders. And then I cried. My father owned a bookshop. Not at first. When I was very young, he just worked in one. But then finally he took the plunge and got some money together and opened his own. I was about 6 by then, and I can remember very clearly the first time I walked into his new shop. It's the best memory I have, the memory that I'd keep above all others. My father believed very strongly in there being a right time for everything, and in doing everything at the right time. When he picked up some holiday photographs, he wouldn't stand out in the street and flick through them, throwing away the moment of seeing them for the first time. He'd keep them in their folder until he was home, until he'd made a cup of tea and settled comfortably in his favourite chair, and then he'd slowly unpack the photos and look through them, one by one, savouring them slowly. Likewise with the shop. He didn't let us come and look at it as soon as the lease was signed, but made us wait until he'd redecorated it and got in all the books, build up his opening stock and arrange them carefully on the shelves. And then, the night before it was due to open, he came and collected my mother and me, and we went down to the shop together, walking slowly through the town as a family, walking to the shop like the customers would. When we reached the dark green door, he smiled and pointed up at the sign above the window. Stark, it said on the top line in gold on green, and then books underneath. Our name was much smaller than the books, and I didn't always understand why. Not then. I thought he was just being modest, as always. It wasn't until much later that I realised why he'd had the sign painted that way, and when I realised, it was too late. And then I felt a bitter twist of sadness that will never go away. He'd had Stark painted small, so that there was enough room for "and son" to be added later, if I wanted it to be. But I never realized, and it never was. We waited while he sorted through the unfamiliar keys, and though I was several feet below their level, I caught the look of quiet pride and love in my mother's face as she watched him open the door. It swung wide, and my father shepherded us into the pools of soft yellow light. Stark Books was a beautiful store. I don't suppose there have been many bookshops like that, and there are certainly none here. My father loved books, loved them with a passion that so few people understand, and he taught me to love them too. My mother taught me what little I know of kindness, and my father showed me that there is magic in a book, that anything can lie between the covers, and that although they are so quiet and still, every one is like a gate. His shop was not so much a place to sell books as a place for them to be. The carpet was thick green, and the bookshelves rich brown, and as we walked quietly among them, it was as if we were visiting the place where the books lived. As we looked in every corner and saw how every inch was my father, my mother and I gripped each other's hand more and more tightly, and the more we saw, the less sure I was that the glow we walked in was due to any lamps. The glow was my parents. We finished the tour at the back of the shop, in front of a door. Without any ceremony, my father reached forward and opened it, and we walked into the back office. It was cosy and warm like the shop, and as my mother walked around, her steps faltered and her mouth hung open, for this was meant to be her place. My mother was an accountant. Before she had me, she had worked for a big firm, and while I was growing up, she did little bits of work for people. Now I was old enough to be at school, and I knew she fancied working full-time again, but she hadn't been able to find a way back in. There were 2 desks in the back office. One had a picture of my mother on it, as my father's desks always did, and on the other was a big red ledger, and a poster hung on the wall beside it. The poster was of a Tiffany-stained glass window, and it was my mother's favourite. The desk also had a little china pot on it, and held a black biro, a red biro, and a green biro. My mother's colours. The colours she used when she prepared people's accounts for them, with her breathtaking neatness. She reached out and ran her hand across the back of the chair that was to be hers, and then dipped her hand into her pocket. She pulled out a small piece of soapstone, a tiny polished figure, and placed it on my father's desk. Then she and my father fell together and hugged each other so tightly I thought bones might break. I wish I'd died then. That would have been enough. But now I was still alive, and they were dead, and as Shelby piloted us over colour towards sound, one arm on the wheel and the other tight around me, I cried and cried until I thought my heart would stop. We came so close to dying half an hour later that thought of my parents had to be pushed to the side for a while. That hurt, like a betrayal of them, but in all that happened afterwards, they were there, and I saw everything through a film of green and gold. The first thing I noticed when I finally got myself under control was that Alkland's breathing, which had been obscured by the violence of my own, was shallow and uneven. I wiped the back of my hand across my eyes and turned his face so that I could look at it. It was deathly pale. "What's wrong with him?" asked Shelby, gripping my arm to leave me free to examine Alkland more closely. "I don't know," I said. But then I saw. I felt it first, in fact. Felt that my leg, the one that I had wrapped around Alkland's, was slightly colder than the rest of me. Looking down, I saw that there was a dark stain on it. Oh no, oh shit! I moved my leg and bent round to look at Auckland's. He'd been shot. I reached down and twisted his leg gently. There was no exit wound. The bullet was still in his thigh. From where it had gone in, it had to be somewhere near the femoral artery, and blood was coursing in a steady stream out of the ragged entry wound. Shelby paled when she saw the dark smear of blood on my fingers, and snapped her eyes back to the front, swallowing tightly. "How bad?" she asked. "Fucking terrible," I said. "He didn't look terrifically well beforehand." "He wasn't. Oh, shit. Where am I headed, Stark?" Cat," I said, and she turned and looked at me. I nodded. "It's the only place we're even slightly safe." "Stark," she said, "far be it from me to question your call, but how are a bunch of cats going to protect you from ACIA? "ACIA are the least of our problems," I said, moving into a position where I could get my jacket off. "Someone else is after us." "And, he has this phobia of cats?" "No." I wrapped one arm of my jacket around Auckland's thin leg and knotted it tightly. Shelby made a small adjustment, and the heliporter banked to the right side, heading towards cat neighborhood. But you see, the cats are on my side." Shelby looked at me for a moment, long enough to see that I wasn't joking, and then she shook her head. "Stark," she said, "you are an odd person." Auckland shuddered deeply, and I tightened my grip on him, looking closely at his face. "If you ever get shot in the leg, take my advice. Make sure you're in the best of health beforehand. Try to ensure it doesn't happen when you're freezing cold, in the dark, hundreds of feet above the ground. You know what? In fact, you might want to give the whole thing a miss. It's not as much fun as it sounds, and it's bad for you. Even worse than smoking, probably." Auckland's skin was deteriorating ever more quickly, its cohesion breaking down. The parts stretched over his increasingly prominent cheekbones looked taut, but his cheeks felt spongy, and my fingers left ripples in the skin that didn't fade. "Is he gonna die?" "I'm amazed he's still alive," I said. I was. The condition he was in from Dreamland alone would have put him near the edge. The amount of blood he was now losing from a major gunshot wound should have finished him off. Somewhere deep inside his failing body, the actioneer must be holding on to life pretty damn tightly. I slacked the tourniquet for a moment to freshen up the blood running around his leg, and then I tightened it again. This done, I stared unseeingly towards the ground for a while, trying to anticipate all the ways in which this was going to make things even more difficult. "Stark," said Shelby, and the eerie calm in her voice made me look up immediately. "I think we have a situation." "What?" I said, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned around at the waist and leant to look over at her feet. When she came back up again, her face was flushed slightly from the run of blood, and I noticed for the first time in quite a while how pretty she was. As if to answer my question, a tiny red light on the heliporter's minimal instrument panel began to flash. Shelby looked at it and then at me, and then smiled a terrible small smile, as if she was realizing for the first time that the kind of thing that I do isn't a game, and that bad things really can happen. "No juice," she said. "Next stop, the ground." "What are you talking about?" I asked gently. "You said you were loaded." "I was. His leg wasn't the only thing that stopped a bullet." The blades of the heliporter missed a beat and we dropped a yard. But then they cut choppily back in. As best as I could do without losing Auckland, I leant over to have a look myself. She was right. The second battery had a large hole in it, and the third was nowhere to be seen. We were a couple of 100 feet above the ground, half a mile from Cat, and we had no gas. "Start heading down," I said, "as quickly as possible." Shelby was already onto it. The blades missed a beat again, and we dropped heartlessly for another couple of yards. "I can't see the ground," she said. "Where do I head for?" I glanced quickly around below us. The gate to Cat was slightly to our right, and still about 600 yards away. It didn't seem likely that we would get that far, never mind clear the wall. Sound doesn't go a bundle on streetlights, and the area beneath us was very dark, dotted with only the occasional unhelpful point of light. "Head towards the gate," I said. "We won't make it, but there's open spaces around there." "Stark," she said suddenly, "if we don't make it—" "Forget that," I said. "I owe you dinner." Auckland moaned slightly. His arm twitched and I nearly lost hold of him. I'll be honest and admit that for a second I thought it might almost have been better if I had. His chances of coming through this were getting smaller by the minute, and his weight was dangerously overloading the failing heliporter. But it was only for a second, and if you think badly of me for thinking that, it just shows that you've never been in a similar position. You'd be surprised how you might react in certain situations, what you'd find out about yourself and your instinct for self-preservation at all costs. As we cruised lower and lower towards sound, the blades cutting out more and more frequently, streets became discernible. There were a fair amount of people around. Shouting hour had just finished, and the normally sparse sprinkling of pedestrians was augmented with pairs of flushed shouters hurrying home. I hoped that if we crashed, we at least did it quietly. Grief from the people of sound was something we could really do without. We passed over the monotrack with less than 5 feet to spare, and Shelby banged the lever hard right to head us towards a patch of open ground. The blades cut out for good when we were still 10 feet above the grass, and suddenly all seemed very quiet as we sailed towards the ground. "Lean backwards," I said quickly. "Tuck up and roll to the side." But she froze, staring with a horrified expression at the ground as it rushed towards us. When we were within a couple of feet, I shoved her and rolled off myself, pulling Auckland with me. We hit the ground hard. Boy, did we hit that ground. All the air was kicked out of my chest, and my entire body jolted with the impact as my shoulder whammed into the earth. I heard a dull crack, followed by a louder, splintering one, and then I blacked out. I was out for less than 30 seconds, thankfully. I think it was from oxygen loss rather than from concussion. I pushed myself painfully into a sitting position and then looked quickly around. The heliporter lay like a mangled grasshopper about 10 feet away. 2 of the blades were broken, but apart from that, it looked less destroyed than I would have expected. Shelby lay in a slightly tidier heap on the other side of me, and I crawled towards her, panting. She was curled up into a ball and hugging her shoulder tightly, eyes screwed shut. I surrounded her with my arms, marvelling, as always, at how bulky, slim girls can feel, and then I put my face close to hers. She opened her eyes. "Shelby," I said, "are you okay?" "I don't know," she said painfully. "How does my hair look?" "Fine," I said, overjoyed that at least I hadn't got her killed. "Rumpled, but it suits you." "I bet," she said, hauling herself into a sitting position. "Ow!" Can you move it?" I said, rubbing her shoulder, and she tentatively held out her arm. She winced, but then rotated the joint gently. What do you know? She said. It works. Seeing the look of relief draped openly across my face, she smiled and patted my cheek. I'm okay, she said. But I'm revising upwardly the cost and extravagance of the meal you owe me, though. Shelby, we'll book Maxim's every night for a week. Yeah, if, she said, as I helped her to her feet. I looked puzzled. The if was there, she said, looking at me, even if you didn't say it. Auckland was lying in a heap a few yards away. In my hurry to check Shelby was all right, I hadn't even thought of him, and now I did. And I remembered the dull snap I'd heard too, because his left leg twisted outwards in a way that it clearly wasn't designed for. Oh, fuck, I moaned, dropping to one knee beside him. The actioneer's breathing reminded me unpleasantly of the sound of the heliporter's blades just before they gave out for good. God, said Shelby, this guy is having a brutal evening. I laid my fingers under Auckland's jaw. The pulse was there, but uneven and weak. I hate to be material at a time like this, Shelby added, but can we do anything about the heliporter? It'll be taken in, I said, trying to bend Auckland's leg into a less baroque position. You can claim it later and they'll mono it to you. Cool, she said. It's just, I'd hate to lose it. Something in her voice made me look up, and I nodded and smiled. Yeah, I said. And then I swore, because I heard the sound of shouting coming from the other side of the patch of ground some distance away. Come on, time to go. Are they, the bad guys? She asked, bending to help me lift Auckland. No, I shouldn't think so, but we don't have time to talk with them. Also, ACIA will be on their way. We have to go. Once Auckland was upright, I heaved him over my shoulder and started immediately towards the looming bulk of the Cat Gateway, which towered out of the dark less than 40 yards away. Shelby strode gamely beside me, occasionally breaking into a trot to keep up. I tried to brace Auckland's leg so that it didn't jolt around too much, but I'm sure that it was just as well that he was already unconscious. They're running now? Shelby observed breathlessly, having glanced behind. Are you sure they're okay? As far as I know, I panted, and then I realized something. They'd shouted. The people running towards us had shouted. Second thoughts. I think they may be bad guys after all. Hurry! When we reached the gateway complex, I took a quick glance back before we ducked into the entrance passage. 4 men in suits were running towards us with an air of alarming dedication. It was too dark to be sure, but they looked dishearteningly like ACIA. One of them noticed me turn and shouted something, but I grabbed Shelby's arm and hurried her into the tunnel. At the bottom, we reached the steps up to the gate itself and vaulted up them 2 at a time. At the top, we walked straight up to the huge old iron gate, and it didn't open. Chapter 19. I got into a fight once over a cat when I was a kid. 2 older boys were chasing it. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. A cat on the run is a match for a boy or 2. But then I noticed that the cat was limping and that one of the boys had a can of lighter fluid. I ran after them. I ran as fast as I could, and I threw myself at the one with the can. I wasn't thinking at all. They took so long beating me up that the cat got away. At the time, I have to admit that I wondered if it had been worth it, but cats have always looked after me since. So far. Hello? I said, bewildered, as we stared up at the gate. I've been to Cat a lot of times, and the gate has always opened before. Hello? The gate continued to not open. You like cats, don't you? I asked eventually, turning desperately to Shelby. I adore them, she said indignantly. Why? It's not letting us in. It won't let anyone in if they don't like cats. Maybe Auckland doesn't like them? No, he does. He tickled Spangle's ear. I heard the sound of running steps echoing from the entrance tunnel and looked up at the gate. Come on, for fuck's sake, I hissed. Let us in. I didn't know who or what I was talking to. There's no computer here as far as I can tell, but something must work it. Is there any other way in? No, this is it. And the walls are very high and very thick. The sound of the footsteps behind us changed. They'd reached the nearest tunnel. Oh, come on, Gate. Those people are going to kill us. There was a pause, and then the gate swung open noiselessly. I shoved Shelby through it and in front of me, and then we darted around to the side as soon as we were through. The gate closed immediately behind us. I motioned to Shelby to follow me and pressed myself up against the wall a few yards to the side of the entrance, just in time to hear the sound of several people clanging into the gate. Where'd they go? Asked a truculent voice. Yeah, dunno. They've got to gone through here. Billag, the sodden gate is locked. They can't be through there. Where then? We came up the same passage. He's right, said a new voice which sounded familiar. They're in there somewhere. Look, sir, gate's locked. I can see that, grated the voice, and I recognised it. It was Darv. This time, it wasn't just foot soldiers after us. The big wheels were turning. It's said that the gates only open if you like cats. I've always assumed that was so much hippie crap. Maybe not. Does anyone here like cats? No. Should know. I hate the little bastards. Yeah, so do I. Right. Next, you stay here with me. You two, get back out into sound and find someone who likes cats. Move it! I breathed out heavily and bitterly. Darv was obviously less stupid when out in the field and altogether more can-do. It wouldn't take long to find someone the gate should open for, and then all they had to do was slip in with him. The gate seemed to be behaving a little oddly, though, judging by the trouble we'd had getting in. Maybe that'd help us. Maybe not. Stark, look, Shelby whispered. 10 yards away, sitting upright in the shadow of a wall, was a black cat. It was regarding us gravely. I peered at it, and then it held my eyes for a moment, but then stood up and walked away, keeping within a few yards of the wall. Follow that cat, I said. Feeling more foolish than I had in quite a while, we followed the cat. After 50 yards, it started to curve away from the wall. I looked back a little nervously, expecting to become visible to Darv and his cohort back at the gate, but the cat was carefully gauging his path, or appeared to be. The further we got to the side, the further away we could get from the wall without being seen from the gate. I pointed this out to Shelby, who nodded, thought about what that implied, and then shook her head with a phased expression. The cat appeared to be leading us across the large park which surrounds the interior of the gateway towards the first main block of buildings. Where is it taking us? Whispered Shelby. Yeah, to Spangle, I assume. Stark, it's just a cat, though, right? Isn't it? Haven't you been here before? No? Oh, right. I filled her in on the interesting world of Cat Neighbourhood as the cat led us into Tabby 5. The streets were deserted, which is unusual. Normally, there's a constant trickle of furry bodies sliding around the streets of Cat at night. Tonight, the cobbled stones were covered in nothing but vestiges of rain and reflections from the streetlights. It was very quiet. To my surprise, we passed straight through Tabby, which is where Spangle usually hangs out when he's here, and instead into Persian 1. My back was beginning to really ache from Alkland's weight, and I stopped myself several times from taking a look at his face. There would only have been bad news there. As we walked, I realised that the streets here were very similar to ones that I'd walked through when he and I first went into Dreamland, when I'd been following the shopping trolley. It probably didn't mean anything, and I didn't try to make it. Like I've said, I'd go mad if I tried to tie up all the loose ends in my life. I have enough trouble tying up the ends that do fit together. About 20 yards in front of us, the cat stopped and sat on the pavement. When we caught up, it stood again and led us to a doorway on one side of the street. A set of worn stone steps led up to a large wooden door mottled with age. At the top, the cat sat down again, looking up at the door. We stood still for a moment, wondering what was coming next, and then Shelby laughed. I was sort of expecting him to open it, she admitted shakily, reaching for the knob. The door opened, and it took a moment before I worked out what I was seeing. At first, I thought the place was full of wool of different colours, sprinkled liberally with green buttons. But it wasn't. In front of us was an entrance hall. At the back of the hall was a staircase, a wide and stately affair that led up to a large foyer. The floor of the entrance hallway, and every available inch of the stairs, was covered in cats. Cats of every possible description and variety sat in ordered ranks, looking at us, and there was not a sound. I heard the sound of Shelby swallowing, and turned to look at her. "Intense," she said. And the cat who had led us stepped over the threshold and disappeared into the morass of fur and whiskers. I took the small step which put me on the doorstep. The cats didn't move. I moved forward another 6 inches. They still didn't move. "What is this?" "Yeah, I don't know," I muttered, disturbed. I get on spectacularly well with cats. It's one of my chief accomplishments. But today, first the entrance gate, and now this. And then, all at once, the cats in the entrance hallway moved apart, and a narrow path opened. I stepped into the space, shifting Alkland yet again over my shoulder so that a different part of me got a turn to ache. Shelby followed me over the threshold. We got halfway across, and then the cats stopped separating. "Now what?" "The door?" I suggested. She shut it, and sure enough the cats sitting on the lower steps began to move apart. And then, for no reason I could see, they all suddenly got up and started milling around. Easily 200 or more of them, walking up and down the steps, padding around the entrance hall, swirling like a river in slow rapids. When we got to the top of the stairs, our guide appeared out of the melee and led us to the large foyer. About 30 yards square, with a recessed area fronted by old wooden desks over on one side, it was clearly the lobby of what had once been a hotel. The whole of the open area was a mass of hundreds, maybe 1,000, rapidly circulating cats. They didn't seem to pay any special attention to us as we walked through, but just kept padding around and rubbing against our legs. Shelby held my arm as we made slow progress through the weaving bodies. I was almost glad that Alkland wasn't awake to see this. He would have wanted an explanation, and I didn't have one. We moved across the lobby towards the staircase on the far side, which was just as wide as the first and just as covered in milling cats. When we were halfway up the stairs, I turned for a moment and looked back down into the lobby, trying to see if there was any pattern in their movements, any discernible sense. But they weren't moving anymore. They were all sitting down again, all facing the way we'd come, looking at the door to the street. All I could see was the back of about 1,000 cats. The same thing happened as we continued up the stairs. Once we were a few steps above them, the cats stopped moving and sat down again, facing the front in ordered ranks. I should have been ready for the first floor of the hotel, but I wasn't. Near the top of the flight, the staircase divided elegantly in two, each half going to join different sides of the first floor. As our heads rose above the level of the floor, I saw that it reached some distance in front of us and as far as the street behind. The area to the side of the stairs was about 10 feet wide, a generous corridor between the stairs and the door-studded wall behind which the hotel suites presumably lay. This corridor landing, mezzanine, whatever sort of architectural thing it was also covered in cats. Hundreds and hundreds of square feet of them. They weren't milling, but sitting silently watching us as we were led to the door of Suite 102. I paused for a moment at the door, looking out over the cats and wondering what was up with them. It wasn't even the fact that they were all here that bothered me, so much as the fact that they all looked so serious. The cats in Cat Neighborhood are always friendly. It's their place, and they have nothing to fear from anyone who comes here. Right now, thousands of eyes stared back at me impassively. Ever since I'd come back from Dreamland, through the flight from Colour and our strange entry into Cat, I'd had a feeling. It's difficult to describe, except that it felt like structure. It felt as if things were coming together in some way, as if something that had been on the horizon for some time was finally getting closer. I didn't like the feeling. Didn't like it at all. I've learned to dislike structure because it generally means that there's something going on which you don't know about. I particularly disliked this one because it felt like it was coming from inside. When the door opened and G stood massively in front of me, I was inarticulately glad to see him. We both were, and for a moment stood just staring at each other. And then he moved forward quickly and grabbed Alkland off my shoulder, rolling him into his grasp in a strangely delicate move that made me realize that a baby might actually be safe in his arms. He turned and walked up the short corridor towards the room at the end. I followed him, slumping now that I only had my own weight to carry, and behind me Shelby reached up and pummeled my shoulders gently. As we entered the main room of the suite, Zenda and Sned stood up. Like G, Sned still managed to look resolutely primitive and dangerous, even when ensconced in the ghost of a 5-star suite. He nodded at me. "I guess you got the right place then, G," he said. G grunted and deposited Alkland gently on the sofa. He ripped the bottom half of the Actioneer's trouser leg off and bent over to examine the damage. I was looking at Zenda, and she was looking at me. Instead of the rich skirts she's worn in recent years, instead of the power suits, she was wearing a pair of battered black trousers and a long coat in very deep green. Her hair was pulled back loosely with a rubber band, and she looked young and tall, just like she always did. She smiled and walked towards me, and I guess I looked like I used to as well, because I've always dressed the same. When she reached out and hugged me, 10 years fell away. But then I felt the structure again and knew that it had to be. It only lasted for a moment, but that was long enough for me to know that things had to change. That finally, this thing had to be. "Broken?" asked Sned in the background. "Yeah," I said, "and shot." Zenda's hand slid down my arm as we moved apart, and I went over to crouch by G at the sofa. Shelby and Zenda exchanged polite greetings. They'd met before, but not often. I don't understand why, but there always seems to be some undercurrent between them. "How bad is it, G?" "Bad. He's gonna die." "No, don't hold back. Give it to me straight." "What can I tell you, Stark? He's gonna fucking die. Look at your front." I did. It was covered in blood. "He's lost a shitload, and he's sick. If this was a medicenter, he might stand a chance, but it's not, and he's not gonna make it to one." I sagged, face in my hands. I've lost clients before, and I guess it's similar to a doctor making a bad call, not doing exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. Someone dies. No matter how much you tell yourself that you did all you could, that you made the best decisions you could make at the time, it still feels like shit. It's not your fault, but at the same time, it really is. I walked back to the center of the room. Zenda, Shelby, and Sned watched me, and I felt unwelcomely at the center of attention. This felt bad. This was not just any client. This was not just any job. The suite felt like a dimly lit stage, and my friends looked like actors left adrift upon it. There was no audience and no script. As I stood there, watched by the eyes of the people who knew what I was, I realized finally that it was all coming down, that I was going to have to find myself again and do something about it. The moment stretched and then burst, and I reached out for the coffee pot at the same time as Shelby asked conversationally, "Are you guys aware that it's like floor-to-ceiling cats out there?" Everyone turned slightly, moved, and the room was just a room again. "Yeah," said Sned, maybe a little uneasily. "It's been filling up for the last couple of hours. Stark's cat is out there somewhere too." He paused and then looked at her. Who are you exactly?" Zenda came and got some coffee too. "Why this suite?" I asked. She shrugged. I found that I was searching for my lighter, studying my coffee, doing everything except looking directly at her. I wonder if she noticed, and if she felt anything. I wished I could tell if it was just me that this was happening to. "We went to Tabby 5, she said, "but Spangle leapt out of my arms and ran here. We followed." She shrugged again, more flamboyantly. I just nodded. "Listen, though," she added seriously. "Something weird is going on." "Yeah, no shit." "Yep, but listen. C came to talk to me about 5 minutes before G called." Hearing this reminded me that Darv and 3 other agents were prowling outside the gate, maybe inside by now. "And?" He looked tired. He looked very tired." "What did he want?" "I'm not sure, and that's what was so weird about it. He came into my office, said hello, and asked how I was, and after that he didn't really have anything to say, but he stayed. It's as if... She came to a halt. As if what? Tell me. It's as if he wanted to say something to me, but he didn't know what it was. He hung around for a couple of minutes, and then he just left. Just before he shut the door, he did say something. He said, "There's something very strange happening, and I don't know what it is. Tell your friend to be careful." Before I could react, G spoke. "Stark, Arkland's in trouble." I walked quickly over to the sofa and looked down at the actioneer. His breathing was very irregular, coming in harsh but shallow bursts, and his face reminded me of my grandfather's face in the snow. The next 30 seconds happened as if driven by a metronome. Sned suddenly cocked his head. "Stark, I can hear sound." "Where?" "Next block." "Are we armed?" "2 guns." "Kill the lights." Sned bounded accurately and soundlessly towards the switches, and the second before the lights went out froze in my head like a still photo. G straightening up and turning, his eyes still on Alkland's dying face. Shelby wrapping her coat around her, looking frightened and alone. Zenda crouching down near the window, and Sned poised over the switches. I moved towards Zenda, and the lights went out. It was very dark. A little light crept from under the door from lamps in the corridor outside, but there were no windows out there. The curtains behind me were drawn and glowed barely perceptibly from a light down in the street. In the room, there were a few soft glints, silhouettes of faces and edges of furniture, but that was all. We listened. Sned's hearing is supernatural. I knew that from experience. It was several minutes before I heard the faintest wisp of sound. It was coming from several streets away. "Can they track us?" I asked in a low tone. "It's possible," said G. "Wet pavements." "Is the door locked downstairs?" "No," said Shelby tonelessly. "Just shut." "What are we gonna do?" "Wait." "Wait for what?" There was a noise from behind a door on one side of the suite. The movement of 5 heads snapping towards it was almost audible. "What's through there?" I hissed. "Bathroom." "What the hell's that sound?" It came again, and this time I realized it was a note. It was a voice singing a note, singing La so quietly that you could barely hear it. The La came again on the same note, and then again. In the dark, I felt the hair on my scalp and neck ripple. I felt moisture pricking in my eyes. I couldn't blink. Zenda clutched my arm tightly, so tightly I thought she'd cut me, and her arm was shaking wildly. None of us were breathing. La, la, la. It sounded like the unself-conscious singing of a child who is absorbed in something else and probably isn't even aware that they're making a sound. There was a soft swishing sound, like a mat moving across a tiled floor, and slowly the door to the bathroom began to open. I had to blink to clear my eyes, and I had to breathe, but not yet. I couldn't. The door swung quietly inwards, opening into a room that was even darker than our own. The pool of darkness inside was still for a moment, and then a glint moved across it. I thought I heard a soft sound from the sofa, a deepening in Auckland's breathing. The glint moved out of the doorway, and the darkness underneath it took shape as it walked into the centre of our suite. It was a little girl. It was a little girl with a pretty, chubby face and blonde hair that stuck out cutely every which way. A hair that a mother would want to cluck over, but which looked beautiful even as it was. Under her arm was a battered teddy bear. La la la, the girl sang quietly. La la la. Auckland's breathing hitched again, and the girl took a wobbly baby stride towards him, grinning as if she'd seen a doggy wagging its tail. She reached out towards Auckland's arm and patted her hand on it, palm open. She waited a moment, and then patted his arm again, a little harder, but still gently, still with love, still like a little girl trying to attract her brother's attention. And then I knew. Slowly the girl began to cry, soundlessly, and her face stretched as her mouth opened in misery, a misery that couldn't find any sounds. She patted Auckland's arm again desperately, her face turning unseeingly towards us, looking not for us, but for a mother that wasn't there, a father who had died years ago. Her breath hitched in time with Auckland's as the pain tried to get out, as the hurt and the terrible incomprehension cut up her heart just as it had done 60 years before. Her brother couldn't help her now either. He was as damaged as badly as she was, still suffering from the same pain and from the guilt of not being able to protect his sister, of seeing the shock settle behind her face so that a smile would never fit there again, of knowing that a hand had pulled her straw hair and bruised her baby's legs. They'd died together that day in the park. That day when someone had taken the little girl's laughter and smashed it against the wall, smashed it until it bled, smashed it until there was nothing left in his filthy hand but silence, a silence that grew between Auckland and Susanna because of all the things they couldn't say to anyone, because of all the ways they never felt again. I heard Zenda sobbing into my jacket behind me and blinked my eyes rapidly. I remembered the photo I'd seen, and the feeling, and as the little girl howled with silent horror behind a pane of glass, I smelt the pain beneath Auckland's still waters. You never think it'll happen to you. You never understand how it could. When a smiling father watches his daughter playing in the garden, laughing and spinning beneath the sky, how can he tell that his little princess will end up insane and jabbering, a flea-ridden bundle of piss-soaked rags in a cardboard box under a bridge? If you looked at all the family albums and saw the little girls clapping their plump hands together in delight, dressed in their best frocks, happy underneath the sun and watched by mothers who look absurdly young, how could you tell which of them would end up scrabbling at their faces, scratching and gouging as they tried to tear off spiders that aren't really there? And if you were that little girl's brother, and you couldn't protect her, and you couldn't heal her, and you couldn't make her smile, could you ever forgive yourself? Auckland coughed violently, his chest arching up as if punched from within, and then suddenly the room was freezing. There was a splitting sound, and a line of intense yellow light appeared on the ceiling, a line that streamed from a crack in Auckland's chest. "Stark!" screamed Shelby, backing sobbing towards the wall. I stood up, feeling my teeth shifting as they clamped together in fury. I heard a cry from the street outside, but it was completely unimportant, and I shouted myself, "I'm coming!" I walked stiffly towards the sofa, past the sobbing child, and Auckland's eyes flew open in horror as he saw death reach out, and he felt the evil which had possessed him for weeks or months drop to the ground to break, used up and finished. G stood up too and threw his gun to Sned. The two of us walked together as we had before, towards the worst of everything, G in step right beside me for the last time. Alkland's chest burst open and we strode into the light.